The nights are long, the days are short, and the weather is chilly to downright cold, depending on where you are. It's a good time to slip into a Quince iconic Mongolian cashmere sweaters, which start at only $50. You can treat yourself to everyday luxury at an affordable price with Quince. If you really want to dive into luxury, you can check out their leather handbags, washable silk shirts, and European linen sheet sets. Whatever you're looking for at Quince, all the prices are 50 to 80% less than similar brands, and they do that by partnering directly with top factories and cutting out the middleman. They only work with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing processes. And of course, they use premium fabrics and finishes for that luxury feel in every piece. But you've already heard me rave about my Quince travel pants. Treat yourself this winter without the luxury price tag. Go to quince.com/traveler for 365-day returns plus free shipping on your order. That's QUINCE.com/traveler to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/traveler. And thanks to Quince for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler.
Make your next move with American Express Business Platinum. You'll get 5 times membership rewards points on flights and prepaid hotels booked on AmexTravel.com. Plus, enjoy access to the American Express Global Lounge Collection. And with the welcome offer of 150,000 points, your business can soar to all new heights. Terms apply. Learn more at americanexpress.com/business-platinum. Amex Business Platinum, built for business by American Express.
Amateur Traveler, episode 930. Today, Amateur Traveler talks about sea lions and dolphins and great white sharks, koalas, emus, dingoes, and wombats as we go to the Eyre Peninsula in southern Australia. This is Chris Christensen from Amateur Traveler. Let's talk about the Eyre Peninsula. I'd like to welcome back to the show James Schomburgk, who has come to talk to us about the Eyre Peninsula in southern Australia. James, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Chris. I'm excited to be back after a few years.
And James, one of my favorite guests, although I said that more than once to more than one guest here, but it's still true. And James has been on 3 times, we were counting, talking about Adelaide, the Kimberley, both in Australia, and then also the Gujarat in Western India.
Yes, yep. We're coming much closer to my home again now.
Now, I had to Google the Eyre Peninsula here. Where is the Eyre Peninsula and why are we talking about it?
So the Eyre Peninsula is on the western side of the state of South Australia. It's a very large peninsula. It literally looks like a triangle, inverted. You could fly to Port Lincoln, which is at the bottom of it, and you could fly there within, it's I think a 20, 30-minute flight from Adelaide. And a lot of people sail across there from Adelaide. People have got nice big yachts, will sail there, but most of us will have to drive there, and it takes 8 hours to drive to Port Lincoln because you have to drive a long way up the top of the triangle and then drive right down to the bottom of the triangle. And because of its remoteness, it's probably got the lowest amount of tourists, I think, in Australia. And yet when you start looking at, as I do a lot of reading about travel, often it's listed as one of the biggest hidden gems in the world because of the scenery. And you asked about why. The scenery is magical if you're looking for the classic Australian beaches, pure white sand, not even golden, white sand beaches, stunning water as a result, fantastic cliff scenery, some of the best surf beaches in the world. One of them is rated one of the best surf beaches on earth, called Cactus Beach, which we'll talk about. There are no cactus there. I'm not sure, so I couldn't find out why they call it Cactus Beach. We don't have cactus in Australia. And I think the food and wine, as usual in South Australia, is amazing. And I think the reason it's rated so highly is the wildlife. The wildlife is certainly what attracts intrepid travellers to go there because it has all the wildlife that people are looking for in Australia, which are all in this one area. Plus, you have the opportunity to swim with great white sharks. That's where they, if you wished it.
Would I please?
It's in a cage.
Okay.
So it's where a lot of the scenes from Jaws was filmed. The original Jaws and Jaws 2 were filmed because of the number of great whites. And unlike a lot of other parts of the world, the great white population is still remaining very healthy thanks to the sea lions. And Swimming with sea lions as well is an amazing thing to do there. You've got the sea wildlife and the land wildlife plus the coastal scenery. And many times you can walk on a white sand beach on your own for kilometre upon kilometre and never see another person and just wonder where are all the people with such magnificent beaches. But it's isolation that to me is the attraction for somebody who's looking for that sort of holiday. It's not a hard trip. The roads are good, but it is the distance. It's a long way from anywhere else that makes it, I think, so quiet.
Excellent. And the name of the peninsula, the Eyre Peninsula, you were telling me before we started recording that this is named after a well-known Australian
Mm,
explorer or explorer of Australia.
that's right.
And I did not know this. So who is Edward John Eyre?
That's right. I was going to, oh, you even know his middle name. That's impressive. Edward John Eyre
No,
was.
Google knows his middle
Uh,
name. That's really less impressive.
so Edward John Eyre is somebody who was a big part of our schooling. You learn in primary school about the famous explorers. We had Burke and Wills, who opened up the north of Australia from Adelaide and went up to the north. Edward John Eyre in the mid 1800s, or earlier than that, sorry, went from Adelaide to Perth. Two-thirds of Australia is from Adelaide west to Perth, but he had to cross the Nullarbor Plain, which is infamous. Nullarbor literally is what it comes from, no trees, Nullarbor. And
Ah,
I only realised it when I went there recently on this trip, actually. I always thought it was a indigenous Aboriginal name, but it's no, it's pretty obvious, Null Arbor. I don't know what made me not realise that, but no trees. And it's the longest straight road and the longest straight railway on Earth. It goes for, I think, 2,000 kilometres without a deviation. You can imagine doing that back in the mid 19th century with very little water, relied a lot on Indigenous people to help him source water. But he made it to what became Perth and opened up the bulk of Australia.
excellent.
And he started, obviously, Eyre Peninsula he found too. Matthew Flinders had found it before that on sail, but he's the one who actually explored the internal side of the peninsula.
Excellent. Now we're going to find a little better tourism infrastructure than he did as we go to the Eyre Peninsula here. And I'm assuming we're going to do this as a road trip because it's going to be hard for me to get my yacht over there.
Yeah.
So, where are we going to start?
If you don't fly, you can fly and then hire a car. So that's the first thing I'll say. If you wish
Hmm.
to, a lot of people do, but it is a very expensive short flight. Unfortunately, Australia's flights are quite cheap when you fly between the capital cities. But when you start flying on smaller flights, it's often 3-4 times the price.
Hmm.
But to be honest, it's a route or route. I think I'm not sure how you call it in the States, but
Either one works.
okay. So it's a route that you take. It's one of those epic road trips, and if you actually look at epic road trips of Australia, this one will often come on it. So I'd highly recommend flying into Adelaide, in the capital of South Australia,
Hmm.
spending some time there,
And we've
and
got a
there,
whole episode that we did on that. So,
absolutely, and then hiring a car and driving up there. And I've done a 7-night itinerary for you. I think that's usually what I is
sure.
probably
Sounds
at the end. I'll suggest some add-ons because you can use this as a starting point for a much longer trip if you wish to do. But the Eyre Peninsula can be nicely done in 7 nights, which is why I thought this was a good one to describe. So the first day is basically getting to the start of the Eyre Peninsula. The
yeah.
top of it is a city called Port Augusta,
Hmm.
which is basically probably the biggest rail hub in Australia because it's where north meets south and where east meets west. And two of the most famous railway lines in Australia, the GAN, which goes from Adelaide to
Hmm.
Darwin, and the Indian Pacific, which goes from the Pacific to the Indian Ocean, from Sydney to Perth, all come across this. It's the one spot where the two meet. But driving there, I would drive not along the coast because it's very boring. I would drive up through the Clare Valley. The Clare Valley is about an hour and a half from Adelaide. It's one of Australia's most famous wine regions. Beautiful area. It would take you probably half an hour longer than driving along the coast, which is quite dry and pretty bland. Clare Valley is, as most wine regions are, very hilly, beautiful wines, fantastic wines, and is one of the world's most famous regions for Riesling.
Okay.
So it's up with the Alsace in France and also with German Rieslings and the standard Australian Shiraz, or Syrah, depending where you're from. And I would drop in on only one winery because you've obviously got to drive further on. Look, it's hard to recommend. You could basically pick any of the wineries there. My
Hmm.
suggestion is always to pick a smaller one, which is easier in Clare Valley because most of the Clare Valley wineries are very small boutique wineries. And often you'll get to meet the winemaker. They're that small and they're very well priced. I was speaking to some Americans I was in Japan with on holiday. He works in the Napa Valley and he was telling me how frighteningly expensive it is to wine taste there.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, Clare Valley, you will pay $5. And in America, it'd be like $3 to taste. And you'll get the full tasting. Often you'll get cheeses to match it, matching cheeses. And then if you buy a bottle of wine, you'll get that $5 refunded. So yeah, very well priced as well. My recommendation and one of my favourites, just to break up your day, is to go to Pikes, as in the fish. Pikes is a beautiful winery which has a fantastic view over the Polish Hill River Valley, called Polish Hill River because most of the people who moved there in the 1840s and 50s were Polish. You could pick many, but Pikes has just got a beautiful setting, great wines, and it's a nice break to have. They've got a beautiful restaurant there where you could have your lunch. Then I would move on up through the southern Flinders Ranges, and that's another one of my favourite places. The Flinders Ranges, a northern mountain range in Australia, runs from basically where I'm talking about now, around Wirrabara, up as far as just south of Coober Pedy, and they're about 800 kilometres long. Spectacular desert range in the north, but in the south, they're quite temperate and occasionally we'll get snow on them, which is rare in our state, but they're reasonably high and there's a very different climate around the range. It's quite wet. So the reason I suggest Wirrabara, it's got a great bakery. It has got bakeries from the 19th century which remained open, but also there's a phenomenon which is massive in Australia called silo art. And Wirrabara is one of the
Okay.
best exponents. People travel all around Australia just to capture photos of silo art. So wheat silos, it's a massive wheat area, and the wheat gets put into large silos. These silos are probably around 100 feet high and often two or three in a row and massive. And rather than just having boring silos in the last 30 years, they've got engaged artists to actually paint them. And
Okay.
they're all around Australia. Wirrabara is one of the best ones. Beautiful artwork of some local birds, which are the size of dinosaurs on the art, and farmers. It's worth a photo. Certainly spectacular, and I'll be talking about a couple other silo art projects. It's worth a stop just to get a photo and move on. You could spend days in this region because it's beautiful mountain scenery, great hiking, but we're heading up to the Eyre Peninsula. My next stop would be Melrose, which
And
is
you mentioned a bakery, but you didn't say the name.
it's Wirrabara Bakery.
Okay.
Yeah, it's over town. There is another one called Stone Hut, which is literally a stone hut. And you drive through the town and you don't realize that's all it is. It is a hut and it's only one building and it's a bakery in the middle of nowhere. And it's one of the oldest bakeries in Australia that got resurrected by an Englishman about 20 years ago. And people drive all around Australia to go to his bakery as well, Stone Hut. Beautiful, but if you blink, you'll miss it, literally. You slow down from 110 to 80 kilometres an hour to go past this bakery, and you'll see tons of cars sitting out there. So you can either go to Wirrabara Bakery in the town, or just out of the town is Stoneheart Bakery. Both of them have fantastic hot pies, Australian pies, which meat pies, not desserts. So pies filled with might be tandoori chicken, or they also have classic steak pies and so on. So very Australian dish to have and highly recommend if you haven't had lunch already. But they
So it's
also do
the
fantastic
Australian
cakes.
version of a Cornish pasty, it sounds.
No, Cornish pasties are also very common on the York Peninsula, which is between the Eyre Peninsula and Adelaide.
Hmm.
It was basically founded by the Cornish because there's a lot of mining there. There was a lot of
Okay.
copper mining. So Cornish pasties are very much more vegetable based
Okay.
with a little bit of meat in it. So we have pies and pasties. It looks like an American pie, but it's filled with meat.
Okay.
But fantastic. They are not healthy, but they taste amazingly well, especially with tomato sauce, as we call it, or ketchup. And it's often an institution you do when you drive on road trips in Australia. You find a great bakery and will have a lunch of a pie or a Cornish pasty, and then get a really nice cake as well. Probably the most famous cake in South Australia is a Kitchener bun, named after Lord Kitchener. And evidently it was his favourite cake, and we took it over, and it's basically a beautiful, almost like a donut material that looks like a Pac-Man, but it's
Hmm.
filled, it's like a Pac-Man, so split open, and where it's split open, they basically fill it with about 4 inches of cream and jam, and with a massive amount of sugar over the top. Not great for cholesterol, but gosh, they taste good. So onwards to Melrose, which would take you about another half an hour. Melrose is a very popular tourist town. It's when the mountains or the hills start to become much larger. The first large mountain of the Flinders is Mount Remarkable, which is what sits at the base of. Now, it's a fantastic walk. There's some fantastic canyons through the region, but again, it would have to be a separate trip. But just going to Melrose is fantastic. It's a very old town, 18th, 19th century town that sits at the foot of a large mountain. The large mountain is looming directly above. Beautiful scenery. Again, great places to grab a coffee. Again, I'd suggest only 20, 30 minutes because unfortunately you're going to have to move on because you've still got a long way to go for this trip. So this is just a way of seeing some incredible scenery and avoiding the coastal scenery, which is pretty bland.
And we should say that in the episode we did on Adelaide, we did talk about the Flinders Ranges and
That's
staying out
right.
here and going to Mount Remarkable. So if you feel like we should have spent more time on that, go back and listen to that episode.
Spot on. Thank you.
And by the way,
So,
the Kitchener bun
yeah.
is a Berliner.
Oh, is that
It
what?
comes of German origin, but in World War One, with the anti-German sentiment, they named it after Field Marshal Kitchener, who was one of the British generals, so that they could still sell them, but not with a German name.
There you are. Thank you. That happened a lot in Adelaide. A lot of our
Sure.
German heritage, including myself. My wife's family grew up in a town called Harndorf, which is a very famous town. I described on that. But it used to be called Ambleside during the war. But they've changed it back to Harndorf now, thankfully. So that happened a lot. I didn't know it happened with Kitchener buns. But it's not quite a Berliner because we do have Berliners. Berliners are solid. Whereas Kitchener bun, if you Google it, imagine a Berliner that's been torn in the center and
Mhm.
lifted up, and then
Yep.
just masses of cream. But it's like a very unhealthy. A Berliner is a health food compared to a Kitchener bun. I would then drive directly on through the southern Flinders to Port Augusta, which I
Okay.
mentioned before. There's not much to see at Port Augusta, to be honest. It's a very industrial town. You're basically in the centre of Australia. You head north, you go to Darwin. You go west, you go to Eyre Peninsula or Perth, and you go east, and you end up in New South Wales or Queensland. Port Augusta to Whyalla, which is where I'd stay the first night, is about an hour and a half. So I would drive down to Whyalla and stay there, just simply because that's probably the easiest place to stay. It's not the world's most beautiful city. Many of these cities in South Australia are very industrial. Whyalla
Mm.
is a massive steelworks. But it is worth staying for one reason alone, and that's the magnificent promenade and jetty. It's on the water. The jetty is quite unique. It's like a figure of eight.
Mm.
Massive. It's a massive jetty. And it's worth going there because you will often see dolphins, as we have every time we've been there. Beautiful coloured water, and you will see dolphins pretty much guaranteed from the promenade and from obviously the jetty, the foreshore. But if you are a fanatical snorkeler and don't mind cold water, between May and August, now I haven't been there in May and August, which is our winter, but there is the world famous cuttlefish show there. We
Huh.
have giant cuttlefish which live around the jetty, and the males are all at that stage trying to compete for all the females. They're not little cuttlefish, they're quite large. They're a good 3 meters long, many of them. 3 meters, sorry, 3 feet long. And they are multicolored. They will literally look like fluorescent rainbows, all doing their thing to try and attract. One of the David Attenborough shows went to there. One of the Planet Earth, I think it was two or three, went to Whyalla for that reason alone. It is one of the most rare and spectacular phenomenons of wildlife on Earth. But you have to go in winter. You will need a wetsuit. The Eyre Peninsula is quite warm, actually. That's in the north, and so it's where the ocean finishes. But as a result of it, it's still in winter. It doesn't matter how warm it is; it's still cold. So if you do want to go, if you don't mind not swimming elsewhere, May to August is cool to cold, and as soon as you get down to Port Lincoln, it gets quite cool. The weather is reasonably good. You might get some wet days, but if you're going there to see the giant cuttlefish show, that's the only time they are doing that display.
Okay.
But it is certainly a sight to behold. I haven't done it because I'm not brave enough to go in the water between May and August in Australia. Certainly in the south, I wouldn't anyway. It is darn cold. Which probably leads to a common question is when's the best time to go?
Sure.
If you're not fussed about the cuttlefish, this is a summer holiday because it is going to be, so November, where we just right now when I'm talking, right through to February, you're going to get the ability to swim in some of the most beautiful beaches on Earth. If you're just looking for scenery and you're not doing this as a time to surf and swim, then any time of a year is a good time, really, in the Eyre
Okay.
Peninsula. The weather is really good. It's reasonably dry. It's not desert. It's further north is desert, but this part of it, as you go further south and get down to Port Lincoln, you're almost level with Adelaide in terms of its southern proximity, and the climate's very Mediterranean, but not hot at all. Being coastal, you won't get to above 30 degrees very often around Port Lincoln, but once you head north to Whyalla, summers can be extreme, and extreme up to 45 degrees occasionally. For the further you head
That's
south,
quite
the
warm.
cooler it
Yeah,
gets.
so we're talking
Yeah,
30, 86 Fahrenheit, and anything above 40, way too hot.
yeah, it is. But it does make for a beautiful, not 45, that's too hot for anybody. That's not common. They're only rare days, and the coast drops most of the temperatures down. I think being able to swim on some of these beaches I'm mentioning coming up to now makes it great. So if you love the water, summer, if you don't care about being in the water, any time of the year, really.
Why are there ridges on Reese's peanut butter cups? Probably so they never slip from her hands. Can you imagine? I'd lose it. Luckily, Reese's thought about that. Wonder what else they think about. Probably chocolate and peanut butter.
Sergeant and Mr. Smith, you're gonna love this house.
Bunk beds in a closet?
There's no field manual for finding the right home. But when you do, USAA Homeowners Insurance can help protect it the right way. Restrictions apply.
Day two, we're heading down the right-hand side of the Eyre Peninsula, the eastern side, and we're heading to, first stop I would stop, it's about 2.5 hour drive, is Tumby Bay. There are many little, very cute towns along the way which have very pretty little beaches. The east coast is much more sheltered because it lies between the York Peninsula and the Eyre Peninsula, and as a result, you won't see much wave action, but the beaches are quite pretty. Just very pretty white sand beaches. The surf is on the exposed west side. The west side, where we'll be heading later, is where you'll see some of the world's best surf.
Okay, makes sense.
At Tumby Bay, another silo art, a beautiful one there is of young children swimming and on boogie boards and everything. It's just a cute place to stop. And I would suggest having lunch there and going off, and there's a really nice simple beach walk around to a couple of islands that you can, if you wish, walk across at low tide. But the reason of doing this walk around the beaches, seeing the islands, is it's a beautiful walk. But again, it's almost a guarantee you'll see bottlenose dolphins. Dolphins are a common presence very close to shore, really close to shore. And every time I've been to Tumby Bay, I have had 100% strike rate seeing dolphins.
So this is a trip to bring our binoculars and our telephoto lens, it sounds like.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Then only 30 to 40-minute drive from there is your next stop, and that's where I would stay for 2 nights. One of the prettiest small cities in South Australia and probably in Australia, Port Lincoln. Port Lincoln is a very fast-growing city. It's still very small, only about 20,000 people, but it's very wealthy, one of the wealthiest cities in Australia because of its tuna fishing. Southern bluefin tuna is one of the best places in the world to catch it. A lot of it ends up in China and Japan. The best stuff, unfortunately, doesn't come to our markets because they pay premium fees, and they go a lot to the US too. California loves southern bluefin tuna for their sushi. A lot of millionaires have been made out of their seafood. You can actually swim with tuna, where they actually have tuna farms, as we did. The best tuna is obviously the ones they catch wild, but there is also tuna farms where they've got tuna in massive cages, but you can go in there and swim with them, and they'll throw fish in there with you. So you'll see these
Huh.
when you've got your mask on, you'll have tuna going past you at 40 miles an hour and just missing you, and they are big fish. So it can be a bit scary for some people, but it was a lot of fun for us. We had a ball doing that, and that's just off the water there. But you get there by afternoon, and I think this is where the travel really starts. Your sightseeing really begins. If you're somebody from overseas who is keen on seeing wild koalas, there's two really good farms which have a lot of the gum trees there that the koalas live in. And because it's a lot cooler down there, you'll see the similar wildlife as you'll see in southern South Australia and Victoria and other parts where koalas, you'll see plenty of wild koalas, really large there, big koalas, 7 to 10 kilograms, big ones. And you'll also see lots of kangaroos. And the best thing about Glen Forest Park, so Glen Forest Park and Makira Station both have wild koalas and many kangaroos, kangaroos that you can see, but also ones that you can hand feed, and you can get to hold a koala if you wish to hold a koala. Not the wild ones, but they have some that are in cages, if that's the thing you like doing. But there's also a winery at Glen Forest Park, Port Lincoln Estate Wines, which you can visit as well. Because the climate is much more temperate down this part of Eyre Peninsula, again, there's wine region, a lot of wineries there and some really nice wines there. So if you like wines, as I do, it's another nice thing to do. Cuddle a koala, see wild koalas up in the trees, see kangaroos, and then drink a nice red or a white wine while you're there. And the last thing I would do on that day, and it's probably one of the most spectacular drives I've ever done for coastal scenery, is a road called Whalers Way, as in, because this was a very much a whaling station town when it originated in the 19th century. I've never seen whales here, but I will be talking about whales that I saw a lot. There's a lot of whales that you'll see further up the coast that I'll describe later. But Whalers Way is a private road. You have to pay, I think, about 40 Australian to access it. You can just get it online, or it's pretty simple. It's an honesty system. You just put money in literally a mailbox. You can register online. It's a private road, but it's got some of the most spectacular seaside cliffs, blowholes everywhere, sea caves that you can walk down into, rock pools. You'll see a lot of sea lions. We actually went to one beach, and I'll send some photos later, where we just got mesmerised for it. We saw some of the largest waves I've ever seen in my life. They would have been, I think, 20 to 30 feet, smashing into these rock pools. It was mesmerising. And the water there is absolutely beautiful as well. Again, you'll often be on your own. That's probably one of the best things about it. Many other places have spectacular coastal scenery, but you're sharing it with many other people. You'll usually be on your own. I would then, on the way back, stop by Fishery Bay. Fishery Bay is a beautiful white sand beach, crescent-shaped. Great place to swim if it's warm. There's often dolphins there. But just be aware, it's also been a place of great white attacks where people have been killed. We are in great white country now. Some of the most prolific great whites areas in the world are in this area. So make sure you check that they are dolphins you're walking in to swim with, not a great white. The water is extremely clear. And some of the
Now,
things
as I recall, the numbers are that it happens about once a year in Australia. So it's not every day, but you just don't want to be that one.
No, you don't want to be that one. And look, there hasn't been one in this part of the world for quite a while. There was somebody taken at Elliston, which I'll be describing soon, which is not far from here, last year, but it's not common. And you've got to take precautions. Don't swim in dusk.
Okay.
Swim when it's clear. And unless you're a very good surfer, they usually take surfers or spear divers because of the blood, and surfers because they look like seals. And that's the major food, though. Excuse me.
No, I thought of that
Psychology
when you
is
said
seals.
that you could do the swim with seals experience, and I'm thinking swim with seals where there are great whites. That may not be a great combination, but
No, we didn't think about it when we did it. We only thought about it after. So, but it's swimming with dolphins there is quite a lot of fun, and it is just a beautiful beach. Even if you just go knee deep, it's a beautiful beach and it's just a great place to finish the day. I would stay, as I said, 2 nights in Port Lincoln. The second day, I would suggest one of two options. We chose to swim with sea lions,
Okay.
which was one of the best experiences I've done. Australian sea lions are very large, but these sea lions are not so large. So you go out with, there's a couple of charter companies. I went with one. I'm not sure if we should or shouldn't list names, but there are charter. Oh, we went with Calypso Star Charters. They're not West Indian or anything, but their name is Calypso Star Charters. They were excellent, really professional. But I know the other company is as well. I can't remember the name of the other company. I apologise.
Okay.
But they'll take you out to an island called Langhorne Island. It's in the Lincoln National Park. The sailing itself is spectacular, going along the coast, past numerous islands. And you go to a place where the Australian sea lions, the young adolescent males, are pushed away from their parents, their mothers.
Got it.
But before they're large enough to protect themselves, they live on this island together for safety until they get large enough to be able to fend for themselves somewhat. At this stage, they're probably only 3 to 5 foot long. The large ones get to 10 feet, the Australian sea lions.
Mm-hmm.
And they are extremely curious. You're not allowed to step onto the land. It's a national park and it is a sanctuary for the Australian sea lions, which are endangered. But what will happen is the boat comes in and they come in and they're extremely curious. You don't feed them. You're not allowed to feed them. But they will come around. They are just like dogs. They literally come up to your nose in the water.
Yep.
The water is extremely clear. They'll then swim down to the bottom and look back up at you. And we got some amazing photographs. I had a waterproof camera and we got some stunning photographs. Our children absolutely loved it. It was one of their most favourite experiences. The question about great whites is genuine because this is their favourite food. But they've got a warning system with some sonar, and they have had no great whites in that region for years upon years.
Okay.
Hence why the sea lions go there, because it's quite a safe place for them to be.
Mm-hmm.
I will mention there is a place further north that my son and his girlfriend went to when they were older, Baird Bay, Bairdb, then Bay, which is much safer. So if you want to swim with the sea lions in a different location, we didn't do that. But his photographs of Baird Bay was astonishing, and you get a lot of dolphins there too. That's a lot further up on the trip. But
yeah, I've swum with sea lions twice and enjoyed it immensely both times.
Yeah, they were beautiful. And that's a full day trip. If you're more intrepid, I would love to do it. My wife said over a dead body, and she said it probably would be a dead body, is to swim with the great whites, which is probably why when people think of the Eyre Peninsula and Port Lincoln, those who do travel from overseas, and there are many who do, lots of Americans do go there, it is for that sole reason. The great whites there are massive. I've had many friends do it. They're 4 to 5 meters. What are we talking about? That's 15 to 18 feet long. And I've seen some photos from my friends who've been there. You don't need to be a scuba diver. You go down in a cage and snorkel there. And they guarantee you that it's about a 95% success rate that they will be there. It's Neptune Island,
where success is measured as seeing the sharks, not survival, right? Yeah.
Well, both luckily.
The higher percentage chance of survival, lower percentage chance of seeing the sharks, I think.
I know, and exactly. We were going to go and do it, and then unfortunately we saw a incident that happened in Mexico, I think, where a great white got into the cage and the poor thing couldn't get out. It's quite infamous, and my wife saw it on YouTube and she said, we are not doing this, but until then it was planned. If you don't see one, they'll give you a $300 refund to go on another day. So my suggestion is, if you are going there for the sole reason to swim with great whites, and a lot of people do
it the first day.
Do it the first day because it'll give you a chance the second day. The other option for that, if people do that, is, and you even have a higher success rate, is to sail from Adelaide. There are charter boats from Adelaide that go straight out to that region, because Neptune Island is between Adelaide and Port Lincoln.
Okay.
And you stay on the boat, and it's even a higher success rate. And that's run by the Foxes. The Foxes were the advisors for Steven Spielberg for Jaws. And if you look at the Foxes, he died. He's passed away now because of age, but he got bitten by a great white and survived. He basically had his chest ripped in half, but they managed to stitch it up and he survived. There's quite famous photo of his stitches, which are basically from the top of his shoulder down to his base of his ribs, where the great white took a chunk out of him. or try to. But the Foxes do it from Glenelg, which is a suburb of Adelaide. People who do that say it's an amazing program. Calypso Star Charters do also, who did the Sea Lions, do the Great Whites from Port Lincoln. It's cheaper and it's closer, but I've heard really good things about both of them.
Okay. Yeah, I've definitely had friends who've done the shark diving and loved it.
Yeah, I'm still trying to talk my wife into it, but no luck at the moment because it's so close. Day 4, we were moving on from Port Lincoln now. Your end point is going to be that night, I would suggest Elliston, which is where that person was taken by a great white last year, and beautiful scenery along the way. One of the major highlights to me was swimming with the sea lions, but the other one was Coffin Bay and Coffin Bay National Park. It's a half an hour west from Port Lincoln, and I would drive straight to Coffin Bay National Park, and I would go to one of my favourite beaches in the world. It's called Almonte Beach. It's one of our favourite beaches because you'll usually be on your own. It's magnificent white sand. The beach is absolutely beautiful, fantastic surf. Often you'll see Cape Barren geese are omnipresent there. Cape Barren geese were almost wiped out because they were used for food early on, but have made an amazing comeback, and they often live on the beach, and so you can get some snaps of a very rare bird, which doesn't seem that rare when you're at Almonte Beach. You've got a beautiful island out on the water which looks out over, and it is just a fantastic place to walk, swim, and along the way you'll almost be guaranteed to see emus, which, for those of people who don't know, it's the second largest bird on Earth behind the ostrich.
Right. So
In fact,
flightless.
they are flightless, thankfully. Coffin Bay itself as a town is they can be a bit dangerous, emus. I remember as a child, because they live up near our house, don't hand feed them, because if you stop hand feeding them, they can get quite aggressive. And they are big. They have very large birds. They're not lethal like cassowaries in the north have been, which have in the north of Australia have killed people because of their aggression. Beautiful bird, the cassowary, but highly dangerous. Emus are not so dangerous, but they have got very large claws and very big beaks. But they are great to photograph, and often you can get some great shots of them with the cliffs or the water behind, because they often walk on the beach, and they often walk through the town of Coffin Bay. You'll usually see them just wandering around the streets. And on that, I would be heading back to Coffin Bay Township after you've driven through the national park, then visit Almonte Beach. I'd go back to the town and go tasting oysters. Coffin Bay oysters are probably Australia's most famous oysters. The reason why the west coast of South Australia is famous for its oysters is the water is so clear, unpolluted, and Coffin Bay oysters are sought after everywhere. You will get to shuck them straight from the water, and that's a lot of fun. They put you in boots and put you in waterproof clothing, and you walk out from the beach to a platform, which is quite cool. You're sitting in the water, and they literally come in, they pull out oysters from the water directly, and they teach you how to shuck them safely with gloves. And it's a great experience, is to shuck oysters that have been directly taken from the water there and then. They gave us a glass of Riesling, which is, so this is why it's a great thing to do at lunch. And it's a lot of fun drinking Riesling, and you're sitting in water, but you're warm because you've got these waterproof clothes on. And then you walk back after. It's a lot of fun, and you wouldn't get fresher oysters than that. Once you've done that, I would then spend the rest of the day driving up to Elliston. The coastal scenery between Coffin Bay and Elliston is absolutely fantastic. There are so many places to stop over, look at the cliffs, look at the coast. I've just listed a few of them that are my favourite. Greenlee Beach, it's a little bit north but not far from Coffin Bay, is where they filmed a lot of the movie Gallipoli with Mel Gibson, because the cliffs look very similar to Gallipoli. So if anybody's got a vision of what the Gallipoli looks like, very big cliffs going down to water is what you'll see at Greenlee Beach. There's rock pools, there's fantastic surf. Cummings Monument, I'd also recommend, is a great place to stop with great cliffs. But also, we were lucky, and it's really quite common to see osprey flying over your head at this stage. On that, the other regular visitor to Eyre Peninsula, or visitor, is one of the largest eagles on Earth, the wedge-tailed eagle. which I mentioned about in the Flinders. But you'll see them there as well. Wedge-tails make ospreys look very small, but beautiful birds. If you're into raptors, Eyre Peninsula is a dream, as well as all other bird life there. There are so many different types of parrots. One is called a Port Lincoln parrot because it's a beautiful little parrot, as well as your standard cockatoos. You'll see a lot of Port Lincoln parrots, which are stunning little parrots as well. Loxwell is another place that I recommend for great vistas over the cliffs. Little Bay, Clifftop is another one. And the final one, which is just outside of Elliston, is Anxious Bay. Anxious Bay is I can't remember the reasons, but it was Matthew Flinders who explored this, was somewhat anxious about this, but I'm sorry if I can't tell you the history behind that. But there is a reason he called it Anxious Bay. You'd probably be getting there at sunset, and we went there at sunset. And Elliston's only a small town, but it's had many artists put up fantastic sculptures on the top of cliffs, quite large sculptures. And for every kilometre or so, there's a different sculpture to drive to. Particularly at sunset, the sculptures are fantastic. Some look like Egyptian. There's one that's a pair of thongs, and I can't remember, sorry, a pair of, I don't know what you call them in the States. We call them thongs. We wear them on our feet, not
Yes,
not
flip
underwear.
flops is what we call them.
Flip flops, yeah. So there's a giant pair of flip flops or thongs, as we call them. It's quite novel, really nice artwork. But as well, you're going to get most beautiful sunsets with spectacular cliffs. Some of the photographs that I'll share with you hopefully will highlight how stunning this coastline is. Bright red skies, golden cliffs. It's sandstone cliffs, so they're illuminated bright yellow. We were very lucky to see a storm at the same time, so it was stunning. And we had dolphins swim past us as we were taking photos of this. So they were posing for us. It was a fantastic place to stay, Elliston. Beautiful little town. And
And with all the rocky cliffs and shoals and such, it made Flinders, who was the one who was charting this, anxious.
That's what
Hence,
I thought.
hence
Yeah.
Anxious
Thank
Bay.
you.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. No, that's good.
Be honest. When's the last time you had a homemade meal? We get it. Between meetings, workout classes, and the kids' after-school sports, who's got time to cook? That's where HelloFresh comes in. No matter how busy you get, HelloFresh has everything you need to get an easy, home-cooked meal on the table. With flavor-packed recipes like Parmesan herb-crusted salmon, you'll be filling your kitchen with the cozy aromas of a homemade meal in no time. So go ahead, try HelloFresh. It's homemade, made easy. Learn more at HelloFresh.com.
One of the things I would recommend to do, and I talked about seafood, Port Lincoln, by the way, I forgot to add that there is a great place called the Fresh Fish Place. And funny enough, that's what it sells. What we would do at Port Lincoln was we would buy our fresh fish and actually cook it on the barbecues, which were often in the B&Bs or Airbnbs that we stayed at.
Got it.
There's a great little pub called the Elliston Hotel, which I highly recommend, right on the water. And we got some of the cheapest King George whiting. King George whiting is one of the absolute delicacy fishes of Australia. It's with barramundi, probably the two most sought after fish to eat in Australia. It's a beautiful fleshy whiting and large. It's the largest type of whiting as well. Beautiful non-fishy tasting fish. As I said, very sought after. Probably half the price because it's directly caught off there and they cook it for you, and it was half the price of what we pay in our shops here in Adelaide and was spectacular. And again, I would use every opportunity of eating lamb, which is from the inland, or the whiting there. So the seafood along the whole time, because some of the food in Eyre Peninsula is absolutely fantastic and much healthier than the bakeries I was mentioning before.
What I'm seeing is the inland is predominantly agricultural area, it looks like.
Yeah, it is. There isn't much to see inland, which is why I didn't describe it, until you get up to the top, which is the Gawler Ranges, which you had in another podcast, which, definitely one of the biggest hidden gems, I think, in anywhere I've been. But other than that, it's relatively flat. There are a couple of ranges, but small ranges, but nothing that I would say would be worthy of not leaving. I would stick to the coast. The coast is what people come for. Day 5, you're heading further north. Your end point that day is Streaky Bay, which is right at the top of it. Talia Caves is a beautiful cave which you can walk down into, and it's one of the most Instagrammable spots. It's a bit annoying how many influencers are there, to be honest, but there are a lot of influencers who go to Eyre Peninsula for two reasons: Talia Caves and Lake McDonald, which we'll talk about later. Talia Caves is worth the effort, though. It's a spectacular cave which looks out over the ocean. It is a beautiful place for photography, and again, spectacular cliffs around it as well. You'll then head into Venus Bay, which is a very cute little town. Masses of pelicans on the beach there. If you haven't had enough wildlife already, and you will see so many pelicans, it's not funny. And there's a beautiful walk there called South Head, which we did, which is a very simple walk around the cliffs, beautiful water again, but it's nice to get out of the car and actually do some walking instead of just driving to lookouts and stopping. I would then drive on to Point Labatt Seal Colony, which is the only colony of sea lions which is on the mainland in Australia. And whilst you can't go down to them like you can in Kangaroo Island and see them at Seal Bay, you will get a very good view from the top of the cliff down to them, and there are hundreds of them. So it's definitely worth the drive. The drive to Point Labatt itself is stunning. And this is where I mentioned before, if you hadn't seen the sea lions at Port Lincoln, Baird Bay is very close to this, and that's where you can swim with the sea lions and the dolphins as well.
Got it.
The last place that I would recommend before you reach Streaky Bay is off the coast, and it's one of the few things I've mentioned, is Murphy's Haystacks. Now, Murphy's Haystacks are not haystacks. They are rock formations which are quite trippy. It's on a farm, and you pay, again, a very small fee. I can't remember the fee, but it's very small, $5, I think. And you can walk around these rock formations, which are, there are probably about 100 of them. Some of them, they look like haystacks, but they've got reddish top with the algae, and some of them would be 20 feet high. They are beautiful. They are really quite stunning to walk around. We were very lucky when we were there. We saw goannas when we were there as well, which are monitor lizards, very large monitor lizards, and we saw lots of other lizards. We didn't see any snakes, thankfully, but we saw plenty of lizards there as well. Just to add, I'm very much a photographer. I love wildlife. So for me, just to see this beautiful scenery and see all the lizards there was a real bonus. And it's definitely worth the 5-10 minute deviation to go to Murphy's Haystacks. I'd finish off staying in Streaky Bay that night. And Streaky Bay itself is a beautiful town, and again has its own oyster farms. And one of the fun things to do along the Eyre Peninsula is to compare oysters. We did Coffin Bay oysters, which are by far the most popular in Australia. We then did Streaky Bay oysters. We stayed at a Airbnb and bought a dozen oysters and just brought them home with some fish and had a dozen oysters as an entree, appetizer, I think you call it. And then we had our main course of fish, which we cooked on the barbecue. It was just great, overlooking the water where we stayed. That would be that day. Day 6, I would start the day going to Smoky Bay. And why Smoky Bay? For more oysters. Smoky Bay, to be honest, were my favourite oysters. The fun thing about Smoky Bay is it's a very small, really a village, but 90% of the village is basically oyster farmers. And they will bring the oysters straight down, and you can buy them direct from the farmers. And they would be a third of the price you would buy in the cities. We did pay $10, so about $6 American for a dozen. So we went down the beach, we brought a knife and gloves, and we brought lemons from our home. And that's what we did. That was our bizarre breakfast, was oysters for breakfast, because it was early morning. But sitting on the beach with fresh oysters that you've basically got direct from the farm. We had a dozen each, which was pretty decadent, but when you're paying 10 Australian dollars for oysters, it's worth it. And they were, we think, the best oysters. Having travelled the world and tasted oysters, the thing I'll say about our oysters is they are quite sweet, but the saltiness of them are just fantastic. They are different. And Smoky Bay oysters are definitely different to Coffin Bay. And if you love oysters, if you don't love oysters, you can just move on, because you either love or hate them. There's nothing in between. But luckily we do, and it was a lot of fun to keep trying the seafood for sure. I would then drive through Ceduna, which is the major centre for the western side of South Australia, but there is not much to see there. and I would go further west towards Western Australia to the start of the Nullarbor. 2 reasons: to get the sign on the Nullarbor plain that you've reached it, and it's quite a lot of fun to drive the start of the Nullarbor. And I would go as far as Penong. Penong is famous for 2 reasons. It's got more windmills than anywhere else in Australia. In fact, it's got more windmills than homes. The main reason you go there is to do the drive to Cactus Beach. Cactus Beach is probably Australia's most, with Bells Beach, which is they use for Point Break, I mean, with Keanu Reeves, and Bells Beach and Cactus Beach are probably the 2 most famous surf beaches in Australia. You're a long way west in South Australia here there now. Its remoteness makes it even more of an attraction. The road is dirt road, but it's a good dirt road. We had no problem navigating it. But the drive to Cactus Beach would be one of the most spectacular roads I've ever been on. It starts from Penong, goes past Lake McDonnell. Lake McDonnell is probably one of the most Instagrammable spots you'll ever find. The road bisects a lake. The left side of the lake is a blue lake, and the right side of the lake is pink. And it is the most pink lake. I've been to pink lakes. We went to Western Australia a few months ago and went to one that they say is pink, and we were so shattered. I think they're fooling themselves. If you angle your camera at the right angle and up your colour, you might get a bit of pink. This was fluorescent pink, Lake McDonnell. And not only do you drive, and so the Instagram shot is to often have a drone and people walk down the middle of the road with the thing on both sides. We don't do that. We're not Instagrammers. But it is a beautiful drive. As well as the blue and pink lakes, you have beautiful white sand dunes, which are, many of them are well over 100 foot tall.
Caught my attention is how large they were.
Oh, and so long, so much of it. It's beautiful. So you've got pink lakes, white sand dunes, blue lakes, and it is a spectacular drive. And again, you'll often be on your own, except at the lake. We found 2 Instagrammers that had to be sunning their bikinis and taking photos walking down there, which made us laugh, given it was blowing about a 60-knot wind that day. I don't know how those 2 girls who were doing it weren't swallowing mouthfuls of sand. I'm sure they were. But we actually got some amazing shots of the sand dunes looking like waves because the wind was so strong. It looked like there were waves coming down the sand. It was spectacular. The end of the road is Cactus Beach, which I mentioned before is one of the most famous surf beaches. It is a great place just to watch very experienced surfers. This is not a place to be a beginner surfer at. You have to be exceptional. But the drive itself is beautiful. The beach itself is beautiful, and it's worth the drive to see Lake McDonnell and Cactus Beach. I would then head back to Penong, and I would finish at Nullarbor Roadhouse. At this part of Australia, between really Penong and I think Norseman, which is over on the Western Australian side, there are very few places to stay except roadhouses. And so the roadhouses with accommodation attached, they're quite wild. They're a lot of fun. They are definitely very outback. We stayed at the Nullarbor Roadhouse because it was close. It's about 150 kilometres, but that's close to these. But there's a particular reason is that we wanted to go to the head of Bight, which I'll talk about in our final day in a moment. But the Nullarbor Roadhouse is quite out there. It's in the middle of nowhere on the start of the Nullarbor. There are wild dingoes. When you open the door, we literally had 2 dingoes sitting on our doorstep. Be careful. They are very fine as long as you don't feed them. We had to stop a truck driver who was feeding them a bit of his meat pie. When he stopped feeding them, one of them attacked him, and I had to drive my car towards his massive truck because he was basically couldn't get into his cabin. He was getting pulled down. So they are what they are. They look cute. Dingoes do look cute, but they are wild dogs, not your little golden retrievers. They are dangerous and beautiful for photography. And I got a great photo of one sitting under a sign saying beware of dingoes, and there he was just sitting underneath it. He was posing for me. But it is a great place to visit, stay for the night. It was comfortable motel type accommodation. The food is great and it's a lot of fun. You really do feel like you're outback, really about as outback as you get there. I would wake up early in the morning, just check when the national park opens. Usually it opens around sunrise, and go to the head of Bight. It's spelled BIGHT. The
Mhm.
Great Australian Bight is the largest continuous cliff on Earth, and this is the eastern end of it. And why you'd
Hmm.
go there is to see the southern right whales. They were called right whales because they were the right whales to catch, because they were
Yes, they
so
were
easy to
very
catch.
popular with whalers.
They were. Thankfully, because whaling has been banned, the replenishment of humpbacks and southern rights has been amazing. In fact, when we were in WA, I heard that for the first time in history, they're saying there is now more humpback whales than there were before this whaling started,
Hmm.
which has been a great comeback.
I think the reason they were the right whales is that when you killed them, they floated.
That's exactly right. You're correct. Yes, that's right. They are massive. I think they're maybe the third or fourth largest whale on Earth. We were at the head of Bight. You're on a massive cliff. This is the start of a 1,000 kilometre cliff, continuous cliff. And you're looking out over the cliffs, and directly underneath you, we counted, I think, 21 southern right whales. It's a place where the
Hmm.
mothers calve. So there were a lot of white calves. They start almost pure white and then turn to the more traditional grey. So there were lots of mothers and calves, and as I said, we counted over 20 of them,
Now,
literally
what
directly down.
season was that? Because that would be
That
seasonal.
was that what? Yeah, good point. That was end of August.
Okay,
So they
got it.
tend to be
Winter.
May to August. Yeah, we went there during COVID because we were allowed to travel in our own state, but that was the only place we could travel. And
Hmm.
as usual, we leave these places. You think, oh, I'll see that when I get older. And we thought, okay, how long are we going to leave that? So we decided it was a good time to do it when we did this holiday. But we've been back many times since then because we fell in love with the Eyre Peninsula and have gone in summer as well. But yes, you're right. In summer, they head down south to the Antarctic. Then, after you've done Sunrise, I would stay in Port Augusta, which is a long drive back. It's about 500 kilometres back. So, what's that? About 300 miles or so.
Mhm.
I would stay in Port Augusta on the way back, and then you'd head back to Adelaide the day after. So, that would be your final day stop. I mentioned if you have extra time because it is perfect for a 7-day trip. But obviously, you can continue on and go across the Nullarbor to Perth, and that's one option. The other option is the Gawler Ranges, which are just above the Eyre Peninsula, which were
Mhm.
mentioned before in another one of your podcasts. And you will meet genuine crocodile Dundees out that way, but it is one of the most beautiful places I've ever been to, that you will literally often be the only people in these mountain ranges, as well as seeing Lake Gairdner, which is very similar to Salar de Uyuni in Bolivia, mountains with salt lake all around, and that's
Hmm.
great. Coober Pedy is also from Port Augusta. It's the main route to Coober Pedy in the outback, and the Flinders Ranges as well. If you wanted to, and I would suggest that if you were coming over, particularly from the United States with holidays, this is a great place to experience all of the traditional wildlife, but you could then make that another part, spend more time in South Australia, go on the Great Ocean Road, or go to WA as well. The other thing I forgot to mention is wombats. Wombats are probably my favourite marsupial. We get a bit laissez-faire with koalas because we have koalas in our local area, and we have kangaroos where we live too, where you have to go out at sunset and there's koalas down in our park, which is only a few hundred metres away.
Hmm.
But wombats, as much as we love them, they're much harder to find in the wild. Around Elliston and Cummings Monument, if you go at sunset, you can almost be guaranteed to see wombats. We saw so many wombats. We probably saw somewhere between half a dozen and a dozen wombats over a period, and it was, to see them in the wild is fantastic. But you have to go either sunrise or at dusk. But as I mentioned before with Elliston, when you're going on the tourist drive around the cliffs to see the sculptures, just keep your eyes out for wombats. You'll see the holes everywhere, and I can almost guarantee you'll see wombats as well. So you've got all the sea life that we mentioned before,
Mhm.
seals, dolphins, whales, but you also get all the traditional Aussie wildlife as well. And that would be the trip, Chris.
Excellent. And if you're looking for wombats, look for that very strange cubic poop that they do.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it? Beautiful animals. They are, I think, one of the cutest animals, and they're a lot larger than you expect. But yeah, they're like little trucks. You certainly don't want to hit one. I don't want to hit any of our wildlife. But that's probably the last thing I should say is Eyre Peninsula, like a lot of Australia, because there is so much prolific wildlife. Red kangaroos, grey kangaroos, they are most out at dusk and sunrise.
Mm-hmm.
Please be very careful driving at that time of day. You will definitely encounter them, but you want to encounter them without hitting them. So I'd either slow down or keep your driving to avoid sunrise and sunset. Or if you do sunset, as I've suggested, just drive far slower than you anticipate, because they're not the most clever animals and they will come out behind trees before you know it. And from personal experience, there is not much worse than hitting a wild animal. It's not pleasant. Knowing what's happened as a result. So I've learned very early in my driving days, drive a lot slower at dusk and at sunrise as well.
Got it. Before we get to our wrap-up questions, is there anything else we should know before we head down here to the Eyre Peninsula?
No, I don't think so. I think I've pretty much said it. I think my summary would be, this is a place for people who want to do something, who perhaps been to Australia before, but really want to see wildlife, want to get a taste of the outback, but with wine and great seafood.
Excellent. As we go to wrap this up, you know the questions. You're standing in the prettiest spot in the Eyre Peninsula. Where are you standing and what are you looking at?
Like always, like everybody says to you, it's so tough. I would have to say, consistently, it's Almonte Beach at Coffin Bay National Park. That beach is just one of the most beautiful beaches I've ever seen in my life, and I've seen lots of beaches. It is so beautiful, so lonely, as in you'll often be the only person. We were blessed as well with some amazing sunsets around Elliston, but of course, you don't always guarantee you're going to get a bright red sunset. So that was probably the most beautiful sight I've seen. But for consistency, I'd have to say Almonte Beach.
Okay. And one thing we didn't say is Coffin Bay is not as morose the name as it sounds. It's named after Sir Isaac Coffin.
That's right. Yes, it's not a horrible place at all. No, that's true. It's exactly right.
I was hesitant when I went to Google it for what I would find.
Oh, okay.
One thing that makes you laugh and say only in the Eyre Peninsula.
I think for me, it's probably doing oyster tasting constantly and comparing them. It's because I didn't know Cowell on the eastern side also is famous for its oysters, and they taste very different again. Yeah, most people do wine tasting and beer tasting, but you can do oyster tasting and compare which one is your favorite.
Excellent. And if you had to summarize the region in just 3 words, what 3 words would you use?
Beaches, seafood, wildlife.
Excellent. Our guest again has been James Schomburgk. And James, I'm trusting you haven't created a blog since the last time we talked. So
no, I'm sorry. I love travel, but it's not my.
Understand, it's a lot of work.
It is low. Yeah, I've seen people like you, and as much as I love what you do, I love listening to you and listening to all the other speakers, but it's certainly not my career. I'm in awe of what you do, Chris, but I'm certainly not going to be doing blogs. But no, I've got no blogs.
Thanks for coming back on Amateur Traveler and sharing with us your love for South Australia and especially for the Eyre Peninsula.
Thanks again, Chris.
Thanks again to the patrons of the show who help support Amateur Traveler financially. This is my day job now, and I appreciate it. And a special thanks to Lynn Shattuck, who is the latest patron of the show. Thanks, Lynn. If you're interested in learning more about becoming a patron of the show, go to patreon.com/amateurtraveler. I heard from Ed about the episode we did recently on Machu Picchu. Ed said, I really enjoyed the Machu Picchu episode as it brought back memories from last year. I got certified to teach English in Arequipa and ended up spending about 5.5 months in Peru. Like your guest, I found Machu Picchu spectacular and I loved Peru. I also grew up in the suburbs of Rochester, New York. Peru has some cool cities and towns as well as ridiculous scenery. A few comments. If you can do it, I would recommend doing 1 day on the Inca Trail. The views are tremendous, plus it's much more dramatic to first see Machu Picchu from the Sun Gate after several hours of hiking than to see it from ground level after getting off the bus and walking for 15 minutes. For me, the scenery in Machu Picchu area is better than the old structures. If I remember correctly, a guide told us not to get the Machu Picchu stamp in your passport. Apparently, you run the risk of someone deciding it invalidates your passport because it's not a real stamp. If people have the time, I absolutely recommend visiting the western part of Peru. I'm biased, but I love Arequipa and liked it more than Cusco. It's rough around the edges, but has some of the best weather on the planet, a historic area with cool architecture that has a bit of an old Europe vibe, including a fabulous Plaza de Armas, and has fantastic views of a few nearby volcanoes. Lima is a cool city with a really cool coastline in Miraflores, and if you like cats, Prague Kennedy is your place. Western Peru has some great rocky islands with penguins, sea lions, and other wildlife, a desert oasis, Colca Canyon, and some fantastic mountains and volcanoes. While getting ready to fly to Cusco, it occurred to me that I had already seen a tremendous amount of great natural scenery. Sorry for rambling, but the podcast reminded me of some great experiences in my life. And being a semi-retired nomad, I get to go back to Arequipa in late June. I enjoy your podcast. Keep up the good work, Ed. Thanks, Ed. Thanks for your contributions. And I'll put that in the show notes of this episode as well if people want to read that. And with that, we're going to end this episode of Amateur Traveler. If you have any questions, send an email to host@amateurtraveler.com, or better yet, leave a comment on this episode at amateurtraveler.com. And thanks so much for listening.
I got to see one more cathedral. I got to sit in one more